Welcome to Seeking God's Way Bible Study Series, which leads to a new life. Before you, you have your booklet, and we're going to be using this booklet for our Seeking God's Way Bible Study Series. Welcome back. We are now on page 5, Randy, and we're going to be talking about the Old Testament history. Now, if you remember in our last study, we spent some time talking about the Old Covenant. And if we turn our chart back just a moment, you see, we can look at that. And we had this little billboard sign right here that we answered. And the question was, do we follow the Old Covenant today? And of course, the answer was, after we studied our chart, that no, we don't follow the Old Covenant. We follow Jesus under the New Covenant. And we spent our time talking about that. So our next chart then, when we move to our next page, is just very simply the Old Testament history chart. Now, of course, I can't do a lesson that would cover the whole Old Testament. It's a very lengthy thing. So that's not the intent of the chart. The chart is just going to give us a flavor of the Old Testament. And basically what we're looking at is we're wanting to see how God thinks. Because God doesn't change, and so God thinks a certain way, whether it be Old Testament or New Testament. He is the same God. The covenant changed, but our God is the same. So the examples that we find in the Old Testament are what we're going to be looking at, and we're going to begin to learn some things about how God thinks. Now, if you remember in our last study, we also referenced the fact of how we use the Old Testament. We found that in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 6 and 11. And it's actually on this little chart down here in the far corner. You see right there. And it said that we use them as examples how not to live. Well, we can also use it as examples how to live, you see. So some of the stories we're going to look at very briefly are going to tell us a little bit about how to do things right. Then we've got a couple of stories that are going to tell us how we shouldn't do things. We're going to use the examples as the Apostle Paul told us to. And then we're even got, I put one story in here, which is one of my favorites, that deals with someone that's not even Jewish at all, that didn't follow the Old Testament, but when he did what was right, reaped great benefits from God. So we're going to be looking at that as well. So we're actually going to start right here where it says Ecclesiastes chapter 12, 13 through 14. Now, the book of Ecclesiastes is written by King Solomon in the Old Testament. And he was, according to the Old Testament, the wisest man to ever live because he asked God for wisdom. And God gave him wisdom. The book of Ecclesiastes is kind of interesting because it kind of chronicles for us everything that Solomon tried in his life to do. You know, he grew gardens, he had multiple wives, he had all kinds of situations that he tried, trying to find happiness. And when he gets to the end of his book, he tells us the conclusion of the matter. So, Marvin, we're going to start with you, if you will, and we're going to be in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, 13 and 14.
All right. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil.
Okay, so here is the conclusion. Now, Randy, in your Revised Standard, it says something it doesn't say it differently. It just adds a thought there in the second portion of that. What does it say? Just read verse 14 for me.
For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil.
Okay. So now what do we get from this? The end result. Solomon put all of his wisdom in this. And he says, in the end, there's only one important thing. What is it?
Fear God and keep His commandments.
Fear God and keep His commandments.
And he said this is the duty of man.
The duty.
Yeah.
The word duty.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So Solomon's final conclusion, after having more wealth than anyone else and having tried every kind of sinful behavior possible, he comes back to God in the end and he says, you know, after trying all of these things, what I find is to keep God's commandments. That's the only duty I have. And so as we begin our thoughts in the Old Testament, this is the recurring theme. When people do the duties of God, they reap great benefits. When they don't, then God judges them justly. Now on our chart here, if you notice, I've had this little passage right here on the side where it says Acts chapter 7, 1 through 53. And we're not going to read that. But this is a very important little passage. And usually I encourage people to read it through, maybe a couple of times. What you'll find here is where Stephen, a first century preacher, was brought before the Sanhedrin, which was the ruling council of the Jews in Jesus' day. And he is being chastised for his belief in Jesus. So he recounts in 53 verses the whole Old Testament.
That's pretty good.
It is really good. And of course he ends up by bringing Jesus into the picture, and then they get mad at him and they stone him to death. So that's the end of verse 53. But of all the chapters in the Bible about the Old Testament, this one is probably about as complete as you're going to get. I could never write the history he wrote in 53 verses in a chapter. So it's a wonderful thing to sit down and just read through how Stephen in the first century viewed the Old Testament, bringing us all the way up to Jesus. So that's why it's on our chart there, and I'll encourage you to read that in your own time. All right, so we're going to begin right down here with the creation of people. And instead of beginning in Genesis, where we might think we ought to begin, in the beginning God created, we're instead going to listen to Solomon again in Ecclesiastes, and we're going to start in chapter 7, verse 29. Now actually I want to read both these verses together. So Randy, I want you to read 7:29. Okay. And then if you'll find 8:11 down there, is it on your next page? Okay.
Yeah.
So you know where you're going. So that way we're going to read these two together. And we're going to talk a little bit about what Solomon's wisdom offered him in the idea of creation of people.
Okay.
Ecclesiastes 7:29 first.
Behold, this alone I found, that God made man upright, but they sought out many devices or schemes.
Okay. Now let's read 8:11.
Because sentence against an evil deed is not executed speedily, the heart of the sons of men is fully set to do evil.
Okay. So in the first one, we have scheming men.
Mm-hmm.
Why did they scheme? You know,
Yeah.
they sinned. It goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden, and it's thinking, right? You know, the idea of the creation. They sinned, and they sought out their own, some translations use the word devices or schemes.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we're pretty good at figuring out things ourselves, but we also like to scheme.
Yeah.
You know, it's not a positive word, it's a negative one.
That's true.
Yeah. In the second verse, in chapter 8, verse 11, we then have, of course, this idea when a sentence for a crime, for a sin, is not swiftly, is not speedily, brought down by the judge, then what happens to the heart of men?
They figure they can continue to do it.
They can get by with it, you know. And I really say, kind of in this kind of thinking, whenever we aren't judged instantaneously, we think we get by with it.
Yep.
You know, in the Old Testament, they thought this too sometimes, only to find out that God wasn't sleeping. He woke up very quickly and judged them very often and very precisely sometimes because of this. You know, in our age, though, unfortunately, some of our laws and things have become of such a nature that some people get off with their crimes. And when they get off with their crimes, they just immediately go right back to doing what's wrong. And whenever our system breaks down, which sometimes it does, and I would suppose any human system would at some time, but sometimes because of some little error or something, they get off and they think they've beat the system.
Well, it's sort of like raising a child. If they do something wrong and you don't let them know it right then, they'll keep pushing the envelope until
you finally set the parameters
Exactly.
for them. Okay. Well, in our Old Testament history, we're going to be looking at the fact that God did set the parameters. And He's pretty precise in how He goes about doing it. And we have a lot of stories that offer that picture. We have, first off, we're going to be looking at some of the positive ones. In fact, we're going to look at three. We're going to look at Noah, Abraham, and Moses. And they are majoritatively known by people who know anything about the Old Testament. You're going to know a little bit about Moses. He gave the Ten Commandments, you know. You're going to know maybe a little bit about Abraham. We're going to talk a little bit about him. And of course, who can mistake Noah? You know, the one for where the flood took place and all the animals and such. Now, we can't read all of this, and I encourage you, if you're really into history, go back and read the story of Noah. You can find it there in Genesis chapter 5, 6, and 7. You can read about Abraham in the Old Testament, even though we're going to look at a New Testament passage. You could go back and read about Moses and the story of Moses. And I encourage you to do so. That's always fun to do. But for our study, we're just not able to go into that great a detail. So we're going to start with Noah did everything. Now, because we're only going to read certain little passages, and in this case we're going to read Genesis chapter 5, 5 through 8, and then chapter 7, verse 5. I'm going to fill in the story a little bit so that we don't have to read all of that. Okay. Of course, we know Noah, and at the end of Genesis chapter 5, we find that God is very upset with man because man has continued to sin since the garden, and it's gotten worse and worse and worse until most of society, if not almost all of society, is sinful. And God is very discouraged. He comes down and looks at man and he says, everywhere I go, there's nothing but sin. So he finally decides, which is what we're going to read a little bit of, he finally decides that I'm just going to just destroy these people. And everything I created, I'm fed up with it, basically. And so let's read Genesis chapter 6, 5 through 8, and that's what it tells us there, actually. So we'll go to Genesis 6, verses 5 through 8. Martin, I think you're up.
Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. So the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping things and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord.
Okay. So the first part of this, of course, is God's viewpoint, if you will. Sin's everywhere. He's fed up with it. You know, I'm just going to destroy it all. And a lot of people criticize God for this, but I guess we can appreciate the fact that if everything is not what he intended it to be, and everything is sinful, and he's righteous, that this would disturb him greatly. And so he decides that the solution to the problem is completely clean the earth off with water, which is what he plans on doing. He's going to flood it. But we begin to learn something about God here, some of the first steps of, and very important information that we learn. The first thing we learn is that when you have someone like Noah, which is the verse you read at the end there, when you find someone that has grace, or someone that finds that God finds pleasing, like Noah.
And mine said favor.
Favor,
Yeah.
okay. Then we have a new variable in the story. If it wasn't for this man Noah, God would simply have wiped everything off the earth and we're done with it, you see, because there'd be no reason to keep it. But because Noah found favor or grace, God decides to preserve him. So let's read 8:11. Marvin.
Oh,
8:11.
we're going back to that one?
No, we did 7:29. Oh no,
We're up here.
we're at 7:5. There we go. Sorry about that.
That's
7:5.
Okay.
Genesis 7:5.
And Noah did according to all that the Lord had commanded him.
See there, I got on the wrong line, but that's a good passage, right? You know,
Oh, yeah.
God did. Noah did what?
All that God commanded him.
Now you know we picked on those words before. All.
All of it.
How much does all mean?
Everything, all of it.
So when God told Noah go build a boat, and he'd never seen a boat, what did he do?
He went and built a boat.
Hey, he went and built a boat. And when God said bring in the animals two by two, even though God called him to do so, did Noah make some kind of a big thing about skunks? No, we've got skunks on the earth, so the skunks got to come in just like everything else, you see. He didn't pick and choose. He just did what God says. Can you imagine the criticism that Noah took from everybody? Because the Bible says there'd never been rain upon the earth up to this point. So he'd never seen rain, you know. I don't know that there was any need for boats at this point because there's no mention of them prior to this, so I don't know that he ever saw a boat. He undoubtedly was a pretty good carpenter, you know, but and then there's some specifics about that boat, right? You're going to use gopher wood. What if Noah had said, you know, gopher wood's just pretty hard to come by. I think I'll use pine. What would have happened to the boat?
What would have happened to Noah?
What would have happened to Noah?
He'd be swimming with
He
the
would have
rest.
sunk. You know, I mean,
Yeah.
he wouldn't have done
All that God
all
commanded.
that God commanded him. And he pitched it just a certain way. And he did it just like God said. Now, Noah wasn't perfect. In fact, if you read the story of Noah, you find he wasn't perfect. But in this particular situation, he did just exactly what God commanded. So when God said, build it this size, this big, this wide, this high out of gopher wood, and you pitch it the way I told you to pitch it, undoubtedly, Noah did just exactly what God commanded.
Even though he didn't understand probably fully.
How could he understand?
Yeah.
You know, and yet he understood enough about God to know that if he didn't do what was right, he would perish with the rest of the world. Instead, he not only saved himself, he saved his family in this boat. So, of course, the rest of the story is very simple, right? The rain does come. God does bring the animals in. The rain does come. The world is cleansed of it all. And Noah and his family are preserved because he was a righteous man. And guess what? We're here today because Noah found favor in the eyes of God by keeping his commands. So what a wonderful man we have in Noah as this very simple example. But it's very important to recognize he had to do exactly what God commanded, or he would not have been in favor. Now we can learn something about that. If we do what God commands, we can have favor. What happens if we don't? No favor. Okay, so that's our first story. It's just a simple one there with Noah. Now let's go to our second story, Abraham. Now he's a kind of a different character altogether than Noah, but still one of the most prominent ones. If you talk to Jewish people today, of course they say Father Abraham, you know, because he was their biological father in that sense. He's a notable character in the Old Testament. He came from the Ur of the Chaldees, and by the word of God traveled, you know, and came. He was a nomad, and he traveled through all of the land of Canaan, all the way across these countries and many deserts by the command of God, with the anticipation that someday his people would receive Palestine as we know it today as the inheritance. But Abraham had, you know, his own little struggles here and there. But on the particular occasion that we're going to talk about, we're going to talk about his faith. And if anything that we know about Abraham, maybe, it's the faith of Abraham. Okay. Now, in James chapter 2, verses 14 through 26, we have the Lord's brother who records for us this particular incident. He goes into some depth. This is a little bit of a lengthy reading, but I think you can handle it, right, Randy? Okay, so we're going to be in James chapter 2, and we're going to read 14 through 26. Now, we're actually going to get the chance to listen about two people. We're going to listen a little bit about Abraham and what made him so great, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. But then we're also going to be introduced to a lady, which I think is very interesting, and her name is Rahab. Okay, so she kind of comes into the end of this little play. I didn't really put her on the chart here, but I find it wonderful that James used not only Abraham as an example, but Rahab, a lady in the Old Testament, as an example. So the ladies of the Old Testament were just as much examples as were the men in this. So let's read James chapter 2, 14 through 26. And we'll just settle back here while you read right through that.
What does it profit, my brethren, if a man says he has faith, but has not works? Can his faith save him? If a brother or sister is ill-clad and in lack of daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warmed and filled, without giving them the things needed for the body, what does it profit? So faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. But someone will say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I, by my works, will show you my faith. You believe that God is one. You do well. Even the demons believe and shudder. Do you want to be shown, you shallow man, that faith apart from works is barren? Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered his son Isaac upon the altar? You see that faith was active along with his works, and faith was completed by works. And the scripture was fulfilled which says, Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. And he was called the friend of God. You see that a man is justified by works and not by faith alone. And in the same way was not also Rahab the harlot justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out another way? For as the body apart from the spirit is dead, so faith apart from works is dead.
Okay, now there's a lot in here, and in fact, as we study along in our charts, we're going to deal with this passage a couple of times. Okay, but we want to kind of put our finger on the Old Testament example. Of course, the topic of discussion is faith versus works. You know, a lot of people say they have faith, but do they do anything about it? That's the question that's interesting, okay, in our picture. And he's going to use Abraham as an example. Now, the particular story that is referred to here, there are a lot of stories about Abraham, but this is a very important story. It's a story about Abraham and Isaac, his son, his one and only son, actually, born to Sarah. Now, he had another child by another lady, but this was the one that was promised, and his name was Isaac. And probably somewhere around the age of 12, somewhere along that line, we're not exactly sure, but somewhere probably when he was a young man, Abraham is told by God, you take him up on this mountain and you sacrifice him there to me, a human sacrifice. Now, God had never asked for human sacrifices, you see, and even later on when we have the law of Moses and everything, it was animals that were sacrificed, not people. So we can only imagine that Abraham might have been a bit drawn back by the fact that you gave me this son of promise, and now you want me to go up here and kill him. But when we read the Old Testament record, there's no indication that Abraham said anything about it. He just gets the donkeys ready and everything ready and all the wood ready, and he takes Isaac and his servant and off they go. So they go all the way up on the mountain and they build the altar, and Isaac's even inquisitive. Well, Abraham, Father Abraham, where's the sacrifice?
Surprise.
And all that Abraham says is, God will provide. And it's kind of an interesting answer. He doesn't necessarily look Isaac in the eye. I'm sure it would not have been the most happy of circumstances to say, well, I'm getting ready to kill you. But instead he says, God will provide. And so as he gets everything ready, he binds Isaac. And of course, I'm sure Isaac by now figures out what's going on. Puts him up on the altar and is just about ready to kill him. And God stops him. And after God stops him, God utters for the first time for Abraham and calls Abraham his friend. Now, before that terminology is never used of Abraham. It's based on the fact that Abraham believed or had faith in God. And when God said, go do even something that was a little bit unorthodox, he just did it. He didn't question God. He just stepped up to the plate and said, nope, that's what God said. I trust God, and I will do it. And so his faith was shown by what he did. Now, to finish the story, we don't want to just leave it hanging, right? He lets Isaac loose, and they find then an animal that has been caught there that God undoubtedly provided, and they then, Isaac and Abraham, sacrificed this animal to God. So God did provide in that scene. And from that time on, it goes on to say, God goes on to say to Abraham, now I know that you'll do what I've asked of you, you see. So we have our second example that we're looking at here just a little bit. As with Noah, Noah did everything, and as with Abraham, Abraham did everything. We find nothing in the Old Testament that would say he questioned God and said, why my son? Why am I, Nope, none of that. He just did what God said, even though I would think there's probably no doubt that he didn't quite understand. Okay? But he trusted God. He believed in God. He'd never been disappointed by God. God doesn't disappoint. Another great lesson we learned from the Old Testament. God always does what he says. And Abraham believed this. Now we have our other example, right? We don't want to leave Rahab hanging in the side here. We have this lovely lady. She's only mentioned very briefly. But of course, if you remember the story of Rahab at all, she was a Jerichoanite, I guess is how you would put it. She was in Jericho whenever Jericho fell, after the people of Israel began to enter Canaan land. And she was one of the only few people that survived Jericho when it was destroyed by God and the people of Israel as they entered there. She hid the spies originally. And so she reaped a blessing by God because she obeyed him in that respect. And in fact, one of the most interesting things about Rahab, or at least one of the most interesting things to me, is that she's found in the genealogy of Jesus. So she's one of Jesus' ancestors. And that's interesting also from the fact that she was not Jewish.
That's what I was going to ask. She wasn't Jewish.
She was a Jerichoanite, if you could twist that around your tongue. And it's a wonderful story that here we have a lady that in spite of her own struggles, believed God. You know, the funny thing is, I don't know why she believed God. It doesn't say. But she obviously did. And she trusted him. And God then provided for her and her family as well. So when we have faith, according to James, we have to have a corresponding action, or it's not real faith. And the action is always what God commanded. You see, it's not what I want to do. My faith is not based on what I do, what I want to do, and how I want it done. If it's faith in God, it is based upon what He wants. Okay? So, there's our second and third story. Now let's go to Moses. Now we're not going to spend much time on Moses because we already talked about him a little bit anyway. We talked about the Ten Commandments, right? And they're found on your page there, Deuteronomy chapter 5, 1 through 21. And that's where you find the Ten Commandments. And because most people are familiar with the Ten Commandments, and we're not going to reread them. What I want us to read about Moses, just to kind of put a cap on these three wonderful men of the Old Testament, we want to read chapter 5, 32 and 33. Deuteronomy chapter 5, 32 and 33. Marvin, is it up to you now?
It's up to me.
It's up to you now, okay.
So 32 and 33. Therefore you shall be careful to do as the Lord your God has commanded you. You shall not turn aside to the right hand or to the left. You shall walk in all the ways which the Lord your God has commanded you, that you may live, that it be well with you, and that you may prolong your days in the land which you shall possess.
You remember in our study, if we were to turn our charts back just a little bit here to the traffic sign chart on page 3, remember that one?
Yep.
And in our first little setting here, we discussed the fact that we should not add to or take away from God's Word. Okay. Notice what Moses says here in our chart. What does he say? Don't turn to the
Right?
or to the left,
Right.
but what?
Walk in all the way which the Lord your God has commanded you.
Walk in all the way God, and this comes right after the Ten Commandments are given. So they have the Ten Commandments now, and Moses warns them. So did Moses understand the same thing that Abraham and Noah understood?
I think so.
You walk in the way God commanded you. You don't go to the right, you don't go to the left, you stay just exactly in the path that God commanded. And this was Moses' legacy, if you will. He lived his life walking with God. And he did everything that God commanded him as best he was able. So Moses is a wonderful character as well. We could tell all kinds of stories, but I just wanted to reference the fact that Moses understood the same God that Abraham and Noah did. That you do what he says and God blesses. You don't do what he says and God isn't going to. Now let's move to a story where that is just exactly the case. These two young men called Nadab and Abihu, and we're going to go to Leviticus chapter 10, 1 and 2. Now, I have to prep this a little bit because nobody knows who Nadab and Abihu are. But if you understand the Old Testament at all, there were some major characters. We have, of course, Moses, right? We just talked about him. And then you had the priests. And the priests were started with one individual person. His name was Aaron, the high priest. Now, in Leviticus, Aaron's given the priesthood, and so are the Levites under the old system of Israel. And they were then to conduct all the worship of God. So they did all the sacrifices and all the upkeep of the tabernacle and all the things pertaining to the tabernacle under the system of Moses and the Moses covenant. It was designed in such a way that Aaron would then pass on his responsibilities to his sons whenever he died, basically. And his two firstborn sons were Nadab and Abihu. Okay. So these are the two young men that are in training, if you will, to take over when Aaron no longer is able. So from an early age, they are taught very specifically, and you can find all that information in the book of Leviticus. And of course, we're going to read a little bit here in chapter 10, 1 and 2. But we have these two sons that know what they're supposed to do. They have been trained by their father to do a certain task, and they will do that task. They had special clothes they were supposed to wear. They were supposed to handle certain things a certain way. In this particular case that we're looking here, there is special rules and regulations for starting the fire. So they had a fire that they started, and they put it in, of course, the sacrificial areas, and they burn all the animals on it and everything. There was certain fire performed a certain way. Now, as far as you and me are concerned, fire is fire, right?
Yeah.
But when God says, I want you to do fire this way, then he had a way to go about doing it. And the question then is, what happens if you don't do it that way? That's what we're looking at here. So let's read Leviticus chapter 10, 1 and 2.
Now Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, each took his censer and put fire in it and laid incense on it and offered unholy fire before the Lord, such as he had not commanded them. And fire came forth from the presence of the Lord and devoured them, and they died before the Lord.
Pretty severe, isn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's not waiting.
This is pretty strong stuff. We got Nadab and Abihu that know what they're supposed to do, and all it says is, I mean, it doesn't explain it all to us, but it does say they offered unauthorized fire before the Lord. So there was something wrong with the way they did the fire. Now you can read through Leviticus and you can find how you were supposed to authorize it and what you were supposed to do to get it right and all this kind of stuff. And I would just suppose, it's just my opinion, but they just grabbed, maybe they were in a hurry. I don't know. Well, let's just grab this fire. We're in a hurry, maybe that was the case. Maybe they just didn't know what they were supposed to, how they were exactly what they were doing. And that's kind of what happened. Because if you read on down in the passage, guess what was really going on? They were intoxicated. They'd been drinking too much. And so, you know what happens when you drink too much? You lose a bit of your logic, if you will. So anyway, they grab this fire. They run in there to take care of their job, and it's unauthorized. What does God do?
Kills them.
Burns them up.
Yeah.
Fire from heaven. Okay. Is it serious business to do it God's way?
I'll say it.
Yep.
Very serious business with God. If God is the same God and unchanging, then can he think any different about it? No, you do it my way or not. Like they'll say, my way or the highway, I guess. But I mean, in the picture, we have Nadab and Abihu losing their lives. And in fact, you read on down in the chapter, God even told Aaron, don't you mourn for them. They did what was wrong.
Really?
Wow.
Don't cry, don't utter. And all it says is that Aaron said nothing. You say. In fact, the fire was quite interesting. If you read the story, the fire was so special because their clothes were not burned up. The next two sons of Aaron had to wear them.
Wow.
That would kind of impression it on your mind. Do it God's way.
Mine says you're using the word profane,
Profane.
which is like sin, right?
Right, and it's a sinful, which means you got the right way to do it or a wrong way to do it,
Right,
a
yeah.
sinful way or a righteous way. Yeah, a profane way. Okay, so Nadab and Abihu are then consumed by God. So, our next story. King Saul. Now, if we move a little bit in history, you have the people of Israel settling Canaan land. And they at some point decide they want kings. And the first king chosen is Saul. God chooses him. Pretty good guy to start with. But as time goes on and the kingship kind of went to his head, he got a bit arrogant. On this particular occasion that we're going to look as an example, we're going to look at one particular occasion when really his fall began. He was a good guy up to this point, but then all of a sudden something happens. Now we know a little bit about what took place. First off, we have a prophet, and his name is Samuel, and we're actually going to be reading from his book. We're going to be looking at 1 Samuel chapter 15, verses 10 and 11 to start with. Okay, so we're going to go there to talk about what transpired. But Samuel gets the message from God and then goes to the king and says, okay, this is what God says, go do this. In this particular occasion, Samuel got the message from God, went to Saul and said, okay, this is what God wants you to do. And you can read the whole story. We're just going to read a small portion. I want you to go over to this nation called the Amalekites. They're a vile, sinful nation. And I'm going to use the armies of Israel to judge them. So what are we going to do? This is what I want you to do, Saul. I want you to go over there. I want you to kill them all. I don't want you to bring anything back. I don't want you to bring anybody alive back. I don't want you to bring any of their animals or any of their food. I don't want you to bring it. Just go over there, kill them all, come home, be done with it. Okay?
Wow.
Simple instruction. And so Saul sets out to do the job.
It's harsh, but still.
Pretty harsh, but they were sinners, and this is how God chose to judge them. Okay. So in light of that, what do we have? We have Saul heading out to do the job. And he gets there and does what he thinks he's supposed to do. Okay. We're going to start with 1 Samuel chapter 15, verses 10 and 11. So we've got 10 and 11 to deal with here. Okay. This tells us, and it kind of starts in kind of the middle of the thought, but Samuel's at home, and Saul isn't quite back yet, and God comes to Samuel the prophet and says, uh-oh. Okay, so let's read what he says.
Okay. Now the word of the Lord came to Samuel, saying, I greatly regret that I have set up Saul as king, for he has turned back from following me and has not performed my commandments. And it grieved Samuel, and he cried out to the Lord all night.
Why do you reckon Samuel was grieved?
Well, he knew that the king had done something wrong, and he knew from experience probably what happens to people who do something wrong.
Prophets better than anyone know how God is.
Right.
And does God overlook such wrong? Nope, doesn't seem like it. And all of a sudden, God comes to Samuel and says, Saul, he's done something wrong. And so Samuel weeps all night. Because when you don't obey God, God takes action.
And
We've already learned that.
I'm sure Samuel was after Nahab in the Bible,
Oh, yeah.
so he knew that.
Oh yeah, he knew these stories.
Yeah.
You see the same ones we have, they were already written down.
Yeah.
And so what we have is, we have the prophet knowing full well what God is capable of. All right. So our second passage in chapter 15, 20 through 23, is what God tells Samuel to tell Saul. Okay. Now what Saul does, he goes over there and he does kill him. But he brings back some stuff. He brings back Agag, the king. He brings back some of the plunder. Okay. And he was told not to. That's basically what happened. And so he comes back all proud of himself. He actually says in the passage, he says, I brought back Agag and all this stuff to sacrifice, to worship God over here at this very famous place called Gilgal. That's what I'm going to do. There's only one problem with that. He wasn't told to do that. He was told to go there and kill him and leave it. Okay. Now, we might even say Saul might have been quote-unquote honorable. You know, well, I'll just bring this stuff back and we'll worship God. This will make a great feast, right? Only problem is
He wasn't told to do that.
he wasn't told to do that, right? So now what we're going to read is what God told Samuel to tell Saul. 20 through 23.
But Saul said to Samuel, But I have obeyed the voice of the Lord, and gone on a mission on which the Lord sent me, and brought back Agag, king of Amalek. I have utterly destroyed the Amalekites. But the people took of the plunder sheep and oxen, the best of things which should have been utterly destroyed, to sacrifice to the Lord your God in Gilgal.
Let's pause there a minute, Marvin. Let's kind of get the picture. Notice Saul comes back and says, I did exactly what I was supposed to do.
Yeah, except
I brought back.
Yeah.
You know? And isn't this typical of the human mind?
Yeah.
You know, they're very typical thinking. We can fit into that thinking. You know? And yet, did he, as it says, utterly destroy them? Nope. Were they supposed to bring stuff back?
Nope.
Nope. And so now Samuel has to be the bad guy and tell him what God thinks of the picture. Okay, Marvin, we're ready for you.
Okay. Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he also has rejected you from being king.
Okay. Isn't it just such strong language in a real sense?
And he basically tells them the things you did were bad.
We're bad.
Yeah.
You know, he comes back saying, I want to worship by sacrifice. And Samuel says, but what does God like better? Sacrifice or obey? And the answer?
Obey.
Obey, every time. So it's fine to sacrifice as long as you're obeying. But if you're going to sacrifice and not obey, God prefers obedience. Is worship that important?
Seems to be.
And to worship the right way?
The right way.
And he did not do that. Notice he calls this sin something. Some translations use the word divination, witchcraft. Okay?
Demon worship.
Demon worship, which is what it is. So he says this worship that you wanted to do in the name of God isn't really godly worship, it's demon worship. So bad worship is not just bad worship. Bad worship is worshiping some other god in the eyes of Samuel and God.
Right. Yeah.
You see,
Okay.
if you don't do it right, then no other worship is going to be accepted. And so the consequences for Saul's kingdom, he loses his kingdom. If you read on down a little bit, he tries to repent of it, but the verdict had already come down. He loses his kingdom. And in fact, not only did he lose his kingdom, his son Jonathan loses his life, so he wouldn't become king. And our next king, of course, is David.
Wow.
What a sad
Yeah, it is.
epitaph. All right, final story in the Old Testament. Here we're going to look at a different kind of a picture altogether. And I really like this man Naaman. And I just want to spend a little time here because it's such an involving story, but it's such a beautiful story. Naaman is the commander of the Philistine army. He's got a little problem, though. He's a leper. And being a leper, in the first century, there was no solution for it. There was no antibiotic, so they couldn't heal it. And so Naaman had a real problem. It undoubtedly wasn't very advanced yet, but it was getting there. And if you know anything about leprosy, if it gets too bad, then they had to completely isolate themselves from their families and everything else because it's very contagious. So Naaman, being a commander of the armies, he's looking for a solution. And he's tried everything he knows to try. Finally, he has a little slave girl in his household that's Jewish. And she says, well, down there in Israel, there's a prophet, and he can heal you. Okay? So Naaman's desperate. Okay, so what's he do? Hey, prophet, healing. Let's go figure this out. So he gets his caravan together. He gets money together. He's going to go pay this prophet to get healed. Off they go to Israel to find this prophet, Elisha. So we're going to pick up in 2 Kings chapter 5, 10 through 14. And in this, we're going then to read a little bit about what happens with Naaman. 2 Kings 5, 10 through 14. All right, Randy, I think you're up.
Yeah, I'm up. And Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored, and you shall be clean. But Naaman was angry and went away, saying, behold, I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the place and cure the leper. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean? So he turned and went away in a rage. But his servants came near and said to him, my father, if the prophet had commanded you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much rather then when he says to you, wash and be clean? So he went down and dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean.
Wow.
Yeah.
Quite a story. Now, let's get in the mind of Naaman just a little bit. He's a very important person.
Yeah.
He expects the prophet to come out and,
Yeah. That's what I was
right,
thinking.
do something. The prophet won't even come out and talk to him. Won't even come out of the house, And he sends the servant out.
Kind of like an insult. Isn't
Yeah,
it?
very much so. Sends the servant out. And the servant's going to tell him something. What? Go dip in the Jordan 7 times. And Naaman's offended. Well, that's a muddy mud hole. Why would I want to go down there and do that? Aren't these wonderful rivers in Damascus beautiful and,
And clean.
And clean? And you want me to go down there? No, I'm not doing that. I'm out of here. Okay. But he's got a problem. He's a leper. So the little servant girl comes back into the picture, right? Hey, if he told you to do something grand and great, wouldn't you do it? And he said, well, of course. He says, well, then why not try this? You've tried all the rest of this stuff. You can almost get the impression he'd been to all these other people and they smeared junk on him and, you know, and whatever, because he's tried everything, can't be healed of it. So he laments.
He swallows his
He
pride.
swallows his pride. Off he goes to the Jordan. So he dips down, one, comes up and looks at the spots. Yeah, all right, you're telling me. Dips twice, 3, 4, 5, 6, and he's looking at the spots. This is the stupidest thing I ever did in my life. Until he dips down the 7th time, and what happens?
It's cured.
Cured. Not just cured, what does it say?
I know I'm jealous. He has the flesh of a little child.
A flesh of a little child. You know, there's nothing more pure than a little child's flesh. Oh yeah, you know, everybody wants to touch it. You know, and it's just like that. Okay. Well, the rest of the story is just a little bit fun, and I love the rest of the story. So we have to spend just a moment there. He comes running back to the prophet. The prophet still won't come out to see him. Okay. But he comes back to the prophet and says, look, you know, and here's a bunch of money. Do you want? And he said, nope, don't want anything for it. I was told by God, I do not accept a thing from you. So Naaman's all happy and he heads toward Damascus. He's heading home. Well, the little servant guy, remember him? He's the guy that came out and told him what to do. He's a different character. He wants some of the money. So he runs after Naaman and he says, hang on. The prophet told me to say he changed his mind. He wants a little bit of the money. Okay? But of course, Elisha had not said that. So anyway, Naaman says, well, sure, take what you want. Hey, I'm clean. I'm happy. Right? And so what does he do? He gives the guy some of the money. And God smites the servant with leprosy.
Whoa.
Okay?
Did he head for the Jordan?
Too late.
Too late for that.
Too
Yeah.
late. Okay. And Naaman goes home clean. What does it prove? It proves that when a person obeys God, he always reaps the benefit God offers.
Well, he was looking for both faith and works there.
That's right.
Yeah.
And what's even more interesting is he wasn't Jewish. He just did what the Jewish prophet Elisha said. When people do what God says, they always reap the benefit. Now, we've come to the top of our ladder, and we're going to talk in our next lesson a little bit about the cross. We're going to talk a little bit about this little box down here in our bottom corner right here to kind of finish up our lesson. And this will be kind of a separate from what we've looked at right now, but it's going to continue our thoughts about the Old Testament history lesson.